Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Israeli Impunity and the Palestinian Reality. Massachusetts Institute of Technology strives to create a truly open forum in which diverse opinions can be expressed and heard. It is the right of members of the Institute Committee and invited guests to express their views and opinions at MIT. We will protect the rights of individuals to speak and the rights of those members of the Institute community who wish to hear and communicate with an invited speaker. Members of the MIT community also have a right to express their opposition to a speaker in appropriate ways, both within the confines of this building and outside the facility. However, participants must not interfere with communication between a speaker and members of the audience. If the hosts of this event or MIT representatives believe that attendees are interfering unduly with the speaker's freedom of expression, those attendees will be warned. If the warnings are not heeded and the interference continues, then the individuals responsible may be removed from the building. In addition to instances of disturbances during the event, if any attendee jeopardizes the safety of themselves and their fellow attendees, MIT representatives reserve the right to remove those individuals from this event. We reaffirm these policies in order to most fully protect the rights of free expression for speakers and protesters alike, as set forth by sections 9.1, 9.5, and 12.7e of the MIT Policies and Procedures, and sections 2.6 and 2.8 of the MIT Mind and Handbook. Fellow guests, at MIT, we are a community famously fluent in the language of science and technology. We celebrate the forces that create culture, shape cities, and foster enterprise. We delight in discovery, design, and invention. We revel in the power of education to change the fate of individuals, communities, and nations. And we are deeply attuned to humanity's great global challenges, determined to use our distinctive strengths and values in service to humankind. We hope you will join us in seeking fresh answers to the compelling problems of our time. These challenges will demand the best that we have to offer, and we cannot wait to get started. In light of President Raphael Reif's inauguration theme, One Community, Together in Service, Palestine at MIT and the MIT Arab Students Organization have collaborated to host this panel with Professor Noam Chomsky and Dr. Gilbert to discuss the Palestinian struggle under the Israeli occupation. Freedom of speech is essential at MIT, as on other college and university campuses. I am proud to be at a place where students are empowered to advance issues of justice in society, even as they advance science and technology. It's a real honor for me to moderate the event for today. Please join me in welcoming our guests and our distinguished speakers, Professor Noam Chomsky and Dr. Gilbert. As the agenda goes, we will start with Professor Chomsky's speech for 40 minutes, followed by Dr. Gilbert's speech for 40 minutes, and then we will end with 40 minutes of Q&A. So now let's get straight to the first speaker, who doesn't really need an introduction. Professor Avram Noam Chomsky is an American linguist, philosopher, cognitive scientist, logician, political commentator, social justice activist. Professor Chomsky has always been an advocate of the Palestinian cause and has talked previously on several panels hosted by Palestine at MIT.
Thanks. I was asked to speak about structural violence and its fruits, and I can't improve on the words used to describe this issue by the incomparable Israeli journalist Amira Haas. What is happening now, she writes, speaking of the growing catastrophe, is a war that does not start with the Jewish victims, does not end when no Jews are murdered. The Palestinians are fighting for their life in the full sense of the word. We Israeli Jews are fighting for our privilege as a nation of masters in the full ugliness of the term. That we notice there's a war on only when Jews are murdered does not cancel out the fact that Palestinians are being killed all the time, and that all the time we are doing everything in our power to make their lives unbearable. Most of the time, it's a unilateral war waged by us to get them to say yes to the master. Thank you very much for keeping us alive in our reservations. When something in the war's one-sidedness is disturbed and Jews are murdered, then we pay attention. The structural violence has deep roots. It's not to extirpate them is going to be certainly not easy. They're likely to deepen tomorrow when Prime Minister Netanyahu arrives in Washington with a wish list to compensate him for the terrible defeat he suffered by having the Iran deal passed. According to the press, he's likely to ask for an increase in the annual aid to Israel. It's called $3 billion, but if you look at the way it is actually implemented, it's probably double that. Apparently he's going to request that it be increased to $5 billion, but the Israeli authorities said he might settle for $4.5 billion, just a 50% increase. He's also going to request, according to the press, an increase in the 10-year guarantee. It's now $30 billion. He's going to increase that to some unknown amount. According to the Israeli press, the wish list includes a modern aircraft carrier and a fleet of F-15s, the most advanced U.S. fighter bombers. That's kind of hard. The aircraft carrier, at least, is hard to imagine, but what goes on in the world today is pretty hard to imagine anyway, so I'm not sure. On the way are F-35s, the most advanced U.S. Joint Strike Fighter bomber. It's still in the works, but Israel's going to get quite a lot of them in advance of any other country. The former ambassador to the United States, Michael Oren, says that it's about what we need to defend ourselves and what we need to deter Iran. Notice that all of these are offensive weapons. There's nothing there for defense. A fleet of F-15s doesn't do anything for defense, obviously. An aircraft carrier does, nor does anything else. These are for attack, not for defense. And the immediate target of the attack is not kept secret. It's Iran. The United States states openly, publicly, across the spectrum, liberal to conservative, that if the United States unilaterally detects any Iranian departure from what we claim they're supposed to be doing, we will reserve the right to use military force unilaterally to attack them. Israel says the same. Both Israel and the United States have been carrying out acts of war against Iran for some time, against openly, proudly. That includes cyber war, which the Pentagon regards as an act of war, which NATO regards as an act that calls into operation the mutual defense system of NATO, so if any country is attacked, all can respond. That's cyber war, which we carry out regularly and proudly. Proudly, it's announced. Israel assassinates nuclear scientists and so on. And both countries reserve the right to use force unilaterally whenever they choose. In the United States, that's sometimes called all options are open. What that means is that the two states declare themselves to be rogue states to whom international law and conventions are completely irrelevant. They will use force at will, as they choose, and as they have been doing for many years. That's what the new weapons are for, but it's simply a continuation and expansion of what's been going on for many years. Of course, the main target has not been Iran. It's been Palestinians, Lebanese, anyone else who's in the way. For the United States, that's a pretty broad category. But it is worth recognizing that Iran is a very frightening place. It poses an existential threat to Israel, not just a threat, but a threat to its existence. In the United States, uniformly across the spectrum, Iran is described as the gravest threat to world peace. So that's pretty serious. It's maybe worth mentioning on the side that I'm speaking of the United States and Israel. Believe it or not, there's also a world out there, although we don't hear much about it and don't care much about it. And we know their opinions, or we would know at least if the press was willing to report them. The major U.S. polling agency, Gallup, Gallup, does carry out polls of international opinion. And the most recent one asked, among other questions, which country is the gravest threat to world peace? It perhaps won't surprise you to know who the winner was, the United States, by a huge margin. No one else was even close. Way behind in second place was Pakistan. That's surely inflated by the Indian vote, and other countries are way down in the bottom. But that's just the world. And we are lucky here to have a free press, so therefore not a single word about this was published in the United States. But that's okay, because that's what the world deserves anyway. Well, the discrepancy between the United States and Israel on the one hand and the world on the other hand, it does raise an obvious question, which incidentally is virtually never asked in the enormous debate and discussion about the Iran nuclear deal. So let's ask it. What exactly is the Iranian threat? Well, is it a military threat? That disappears very fast. Iran has almost no military force. It has very low military expenditures even by the standards of the region. Iranian military expenditures are about 1/8 of the Gulf states. The Gulf states, way less than Israel, and of course, incomparably less than the United States. So it's not a military threat. Furthermore, Iranian weapons are obsolete. They date to the time of the Shah, when the U.S. was supporting Iran. The other countries have advanced high-tech weaponry, the highest weaponry, the advanced weaponry that the U.S. can provide. So it's not a military threat. There are other pretexts, I won't run through them, time's short, but they collapse pretty quickly just as well. But there is a threat. We shouldn't disregard it. It's described by U.S. intelligence, so I'll just read it. Iran's nuclear program and its willingness to keep open the possibility of developing nuclear weapons is a central part of its deterrent strategy. And if any country in the region needs a deterrent, it's Iran. U.S. intelligence recognizes that. It's obvious why. Furthermore, Israel's strategic room for maneuver in the region would be constrained by an Iranian nuclear deterrent, which is certainly correct. I'm quoting the influential analyst, CIA veteran Bruce Riedel. So in short, there is a problem of deterrence, not deterring Iran, not defending anyone against Iran. The problem is deterring the two rogue states that rampage in the region. And Iran might pose a deterrent, exactly as U.S. intelligence has informed us, again, without reaching the press, but they've informed us. That's serious, that there are states that do not want to tolerate a deterrent, the states that rampage freely in the region. The United States overwhelmingly, Israel second, and there's a recent member of the club, Saudi Arabia, which has in fact been the scourge of the region for a long time. It's the source of both the funding and the ideology for the extremist versions of jihadism, including ISIS and all the rest. Patrick Coburn, one of the leading commentators in the region, has pointed out, I think correctly, that what he calls the Wahhabization, extremist Wahhabi Salafi doctrine of Saudi Arabia, the Wahhabization of Sunni Islam, he says, is one of the most dangerous developments of the region, of the era, and it extends over a large part of the world. What we call terrorism is mostly traces back to the Wahhabization of Sunni Islam. Now, Saudi Arabia has been using its enormous quantities of U.S. military aid in direct aggression. Bahrain to move in to prevent the reformist movement from achieving anything there, and more recently in Yemen, where the U.S.-backed Saudi attack has created a huge humanitarian catastrophe. In addition to the drone attacks, the global assassination campaign that Obama's carrying out. So Saudi Arabia has joined the club, and it's true that these three states cannot tolerate a deterrent for pretty obvious reasons. So there is an existential threat. Well, suppose we agree that Iranian nuclear programs do pose a real threat. Let's just agree with that for the sake of argument. There are a number of ways to deal with this. The obvious way would be to move towards establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone in the region. Is that feasible? That would take care of the threat. Is that feasible? Well, actually, it's very feasible and would probably be implemented if it were not for the U.S. opposition to it. One of the leading proponents of this is Iran, openly, publicly calling for establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone. The conception was, in recent years, introduced by the Arab states, primarily Egypt and others, back in 1995. The Non-Proliferation Treaty has a review every 5 years. The 1955 review, the Arab states insisted that they would not continue with the treaty unless it included moves towards establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone in the region, in the Middle East region. Almost all the world supports this. The support is so strong that the United States is compelled to say, yeah, we think it's a good idea, but not now. Every 5 years, this comes up, and the U.S. blocks it one way or another. The one time the U.S. did not block it was under George W. Bush in 2005. And the reason the U.S. didn't block it then is because the U.S. just refused to attend the meeting, so they couldn't block it. But in 2010, the U.S. returned under Obama, and it was canceled, delayed. Israel said they wouldn't attend, of course, but there was delayed to see what Iran would say, and Iran announced that, yes, they would attend the conference. There was a planned conference to move forward on the establishment of a zone. It was to meet in Helsinki, Finland. And Iran said, yes, they would attend with no preconditions. And a couple of days later, Obama canceled the meeting, saying it's a wonderful idea, but this isn't the right time for it. The most recent case was last April, 2015, when that's, again, the 5th year review, when, again, the U.S. Blocked the moves to establish a nuclear weapons-free zone on the same principles. This time it was joined by Britain and Canada. So that's, for the moment, dead. And notice that a lot is at stake, not just the Middle East, not just nuclear weapons in the Middle East. The Non-Proliferation Treaty is by far the most important arms control treaty. If it disappears, pretty soon there are going to be nuclear weapons everywhere. It hasn't worked properly, but it has succeeded in constraining to a significant extent the spread of nuclear weapons. As they spread, the chances of human survival decline. That's kind of a miracle that we've made it this far when you look at the record. But the more they spread, the lower the probability of survival. But for the United States, it is crucial to threaten the existence of the species by blocking the agreement on a nuclear weapons-free zone, and the Non-Proliferation Treaty is contingent on that. If we continue to block it, the treaty goes. Why are we blocking it? It's not a secret to anyone. To make sure that Israel's nuclear capacities can't be investigated. So in order to ensure that, that is so significant that the survival of the species doesn't weigh much in comparison. This is well understood in the arms control community, but you're going to have to look hard to find it discussed publicly. But you can check it out. It's all easily demonstrated. Well, these phenomena, I could continue, and Netanyahu's visit tomorrow underscore a very central fact about the Israel-Palestine conflict. Very simply, the fate of the Palestinians is quite substantially in our hands. As long as the United States supports Israel's programs, there's very little reason to believe that they'll change. No reason for Israel to desist as long as we have your back, as the official wording goes. We give you everything you want. We prevent you from any investigation, from any, you can do everything with total impunity, so why stop? I mean, no reason. There's a lot of discussion about comparisons between Israel and South Africa, and most of it I think is pretty misleading. But there's one similarity, one analogy that's real and isn't discussed but should be. In 1958, when the nationalist regime was imposing the harsh apartheid structure, the South African foreign minister called in the American ambassador to discuss the situation with him, and what he essentially said is, we know that we're becoming a pariah state. Everyone's going to vote against us in the United Nations. We'll be condemned worldwide. But none of this matters as long as you, the head of the free world, support us. So they can condemn us, they can do whatever they like, but as long as you support us, it doesn't really matter. And it pretty much worked like that. If you look over the subsequent years, I won't go through the details, but opposition to apartheid got so strong that even Congress was passing sanctions, which the President, Ronald Reagan, had to veto. And when Congress passed them over his veto, he went on and violated them anyway. The U.S. continued to support the apartheid regime after even after Israel stopped its support, and even after Thatcher backed off, England, the U.S. continued to support it, right through the Reagan years to the end. And South Africa stood. It was doing reasonably well. Then the U.S. shifted its position, joined the rest of the world, and very quickly, the apartheid system collapsed. Now, I don't want to push this too hard. There are other reasons for this, not just the withdrawal of U.S. support. One reason, and up until this point, the analogy to Israel, I think, is pretty close. But at this point, some differences arise. In the case of South Africa, there were other factors which don't exist in the Israel case. One major factor, which is not discussable in the United States, is a small island named Cuba. Cuba sent military forces to drive the South Africans out of Angola and to compel them to abandon their illegal hold on Namibia, and to make it very clear to the South African leadership that their goal of establishing South Africa, a white nationalist-dominated region, just wasn't going to work. Cuba also sent black soldiers, which was very significant psychologically. It kind of broke the myth of the white Superman who can't be defeated. This was a big shot in the arm to black Africa generally, and South Africans understood it. There's no Cuba in the case of Israel-Palestine. The other factor in the case of South Africa was that there was a settlement that was quite satisfactory to the ruling elite in South Africa, namely to get rid of the apartheid system, but to keep the socioeconomic system intact. So to keep the same privilege, the same repression, but now with some black faces in the limousines. That's not unfamiliar here, but it was a very serious matter in South Africa. And that settlement was acceptable to wealthy elites, multinationals, and so on. Finally, even the US went along with it. There's no real simple counterpart in the Israeli case. But there's enough similarity to merit thinking about it seriously. In the case of Israel, there's a new factor as well. Israel is moving towards a kind of a new system of strategic alliances, partly with India. India has become a very close ally. India is now moving way to the right with an extremist Hindu nationalist leadership, kind of quasi-fascist background, very anti-Muslim. And it's a very natural ally for Israel. Military intelligence, other relations are increasing. The second major ally is China. China doesn't care one way or another about human rights violations. And while the world is outside the United States is moving towards sanctions against Israel and so on, China just entered into a free trade agreement with Israel. And they got plenty of resources, naturally, and again, they have what they call a Muslim problem in the western areas, the Uyghurs and so on. So again, a pretty natural alliance. Another member of the alliance is Saudi Arabia. Israel and Saudi Arabia have always had a kind of tacit alliance, but by now it's coming out quite into the open. There's an article coming out in the main U.S. establishment journal, Foreign Affairs, the next issue, which is, the headline is, "The Israel That Can Say No." And what the article does is run through this growing strategic alliance. And I think the article's exaggerated, but the main point is correct. It does provide Israel with some leeway to disobey the master, at least limited leeway, which is pretty important, worth thinking about. But it's also worth remembering that the United States is still the master by a large margin. There's no country that even comes close in military power and geopolitical influence and wealth, resources, and so on. So the U.S., we remain the master, and what happens here matters very greatly. Well, for that reason, it's quite important to understand what is happening in the United States. What is the received doctrine, standard doctrine about what's going on? As you know, the 20th anniversary of the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin took place a couple days ago, and it led to extensive coverage and discussion in the U.S., which is quite interesting to look at. I'll quote some of it. The New York Times headline discussing it, one headline was, "A murder that killed a peace process. The murder of Yitzhak Rabin ended the peace process." There's a full-page ad that appeared. That's my one visual aid. I haven't reached the computer age, so I'll just show it to you. It's a full page. It says, Israel and the Palestinians, one state or two. That's the choice. picture of Rabin, and it quotes him as saying, "Separation between Israel and the Palestinians is the best solution for resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict." So that was the hope. With Rabin killed, we may be moving to the only alternative, one state, no more two states. The same issue of the New York Times has kind of a think piece by their longtime correspondent there, Isabel Kirshner, and she reviews what has happened since the assassination. Here's what it is. 2 decades ago, the Israeli right and left were sharply divided between those dreaming of a greater Israel from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea and the supporters of Mr. Rabin, who subscribed to the formula of land for peace. The more mainstream Israeli right and left have gravitated over the last 2 decades towards a less ideological center, approaching some kind of consensus on the Palestinian issue. The right wing is now seeking a more moderate middle way. Notice the phrase, a more moderate middle way, annexing about 60% of the West Bank and allowing some kind of autonomy for the 40% heavily populated by Palestinians. The left has abandoned the almost messianic idea of 2 states that was upheld by Rabin. That's the doctrine. What's the reality? If you notice, the quotes from Rabin omit something. They omit what he has claimed to uphold. He did talk about separation between Israelis and Palestinians, but he's not quoted as being in favor of what's attributed to him, the 2 states. And there's a reason for that, namely he was strongly opposed to it, to the end, to the very end, to the day of the assassination, he strongly opposed it. His last speech to the Knesset stated that the goal of the state of Israel must include most of the territory of the land of Israel, Eretz Yisrael, mandatory Palestine. Israel must keep most of that territory, and its capital will be Jerusalem. Jerusalem is an interesting construction. It has almost nothing to do with historic Jerusalem. It's, depending on how you count, 5 or 10 times as large, included all sorts of Arab villages which were destroyed and so on. That's what's called Jerusalem. And that'll be the capital of Israel, which will keep most of the territory of the land of Israel. In short, Rabin's, what he actually stood for is what Kirshner now calls the moderate middle way of the far right, annexing about 60% of the West Bank and allowing some kind of autonomy for the 40% heavily populated by Palestinians. Rabin did accept the Oslo Agreement in 1993. That's supposed to be an indication of his commitment to what is an overwhelming international consensus on a 2-state settlement. Fact of the matter is that the Oslo Agreement said nothing of the sort. There was a famous event on the White House lawn with Clinton standing over Rabin and Arafat, kind of eyeing each other and shaking hands. That was called a day of awe in the Boston Globe. There was a declaration signed, a Declaration of Principles. If you bother to read the Declaration of Principles, it was a total, complete sellout of Palestinian rights, literally. What it says is that the end result of negotiations will be to satisfy UN Resolution 242. Now, those of you who know about the conflict know what that means. That resolution said nothing about Palestinians, nothing about Palestinian rights, had some vague remarks about refugees, that's all. So if that's the end result, there are no Palestinian rights. That's the Declaration of Principles. There were some who refused to attend the Day of Awe on the White House lawn. One of them was Haider Abdel-Shafi, the leading Palestinian nationalist, who had been the chief negotiator in the earlier Madrid negotiations. And they had gotten nowhere because al-Shafi, who was a Palestinian nationalist, refused to accept any agreement that didn't put a limit on Israel settlement expansion. There's a lot of discussion about settlement expansion, but it's a little misleading. The problem isn't the expansion, it's the settlement. They're all illegal by every imaginable criterion. And al-Shafi did insist that any agreement must at least limit expansion, so there couldn't be any progress. Arafat made a kind of end run around him, thanks to Norway, and it was a real sellout. And Haider al-Shafi refused even to attend. Well, that's Oslo under Rabin. Right after the Oslo Agreement in 1993, there was a very rapid expansion of settlements, infrastructure in the occupied territories under Rabin, the peacemaker. Then he was assassinated. Shimon Peres replaced him, at least as much of a dove as Rabin. Peres made it very clear and explicit that there would never be a Palestinian state. In his final news conference right before the election in which Netanyahu replaced him, he informed the international press that this idea of a Palestinian state that you're talking about will never be realized. Actually, this never got reported in the United States for an interesting reason. It was reported in the Israeli press, but what they report is that in the middle of the news conference, all the journalists suddenly left because something really important had happened. There was a verdict in the O.J. Simpson trial. And so they had to all left this insignificant news conference and went out and wrote about that. But an Israeli reporter stayed, apparently didn't care that much, and reported Peres's final statement, so we know it from that. Well, then the Netanyahu administration comes in 1996, which incidentally is the first Israeli administration to recognize that a Palestinian state can be established. First one. Netanyahu's spokesman, when asked by the press, said that we intend to leave something to the Palestinians. We have heard what it is. And if they want, they can call it a state, or they can call it fried chicken. That's the first Israeli recognition that there can be a Palestinian state. And it continues like that. During the Netanyahu period, of course, settlement expansion increased. Under his successor, Barak, increased even faster. Barak's chief negotiator at the 2000 Geneva conference, Shlomo Ben-Ami, who's one of Israel's leading doves, he explained that the Oslo peace process was to lead to a permanent neo-colonial dependency for the Palestinians in the occupied territories with some form of local autonomy. That's the extreme dovish position, Shlomo Ben-Ami. And it goes far back. One of the leading scholars of this period is the Israeli historian Avi Raz. He's published a series of articles. The most recent one, just a couple weeks ago, is called Dodging the Perils of Peace. He goes through in detail the period right after 1967, after the 67 war. And what he concludes is that intoxicated with victory, Israel persistently and deliberately squandered every opportunity for a peaceful accommodation with its Arab adversaries. The desire to keep the territorial spoils of war was irresistible. The policy and practice Israel applied during the formative early years of the half-a-century-long occupation crucially shaped the things to come. Ever since, the unstated, controlling consideration of the Israeli policymakers was the desire to keep as many of the occupied lands as possible with as few Arab inhabitants as possible. That's the guiding principle. Keep as much of the land as you can with as few Arabs as possible. And that's essentially been unchanging, little variations here and there. There was a real test of this in February 1971. The new president of Egypt, Sadat, offered Israel a full peace treaty, everything they wanted, with one condition, withdrawal from the occupied territories. And of course, he was only concerned with the Sinai. Egypt, Jordan made a similar proposal shortly after. Israel considered it and decided to reject it, which I think is the most fateful decision in Israel's history. They had a choice, stark choice at that point, either security or expansion. Peace treaty with Egypt means full security. The alternative was expansion, and at that time it meant expansion into the Sinai, where Israeli forces were driving out tens of thousands of Bedouins, destroying villages, mosques, building up settlements, intending to build a large city, Yamit, on the Mediterranean. So the decision was expansion, not security. And it's continued since. And Israel does have security problems, and that's the reason. If you continue to expand and repress, yes, you're going to have security problems if you reject peaceful settlement. The crucial question, as always, was what would the United States do, as always? And there was a split in the U.S. government. The Secretary of State, William Rogers, was in favor of a political settlement. The National Security Advisor, Henry Kissinger, was opposed, mostly for bureaucratic reasons. He wanted to displace Rogers. And if Rogers said it was raining, he'd say the sun's shining. So since Rogers was in favor of it, Kissinger was against it. He was in favor of what he called stalemate, no negotiations, just force. And at the time, there was a period of real triumphalism. It looked as if force would suffice. You didn't really have to worry about Egypt. Well, Sadat kicked out the Russian advisors, did everything he could to try to bring the United States to support peace. Kissinger managed to block it, soon took over the State Department. Then came the 1973 war, which turned out to be a very close thing for Israel. In fact, for the world. Kissinger called a nuclear alert at one point. By then, Kissinger understood that you can't just disregard Egypt. They're not a basket case. And then he picked up Sadat's offer for negotiations and started a long period of negotiations. And he now takes credit for having, there's an article of his in the Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago where he describes how to settle the problem. He says the real way to do it is the way I did it, not by force, but by negotiations. And then he says, after the 1973 war, Egypt finally agreed to negotiations, and I, the brilliant negotiator, brought about Camp David and so on. Well, I won't, I've just told I have another 2 minutes, so I'll skip a lot of things that ought to be said. The crucial fact, I think, to remember is that a tremendous amount depends on U.S. policy. The European Union has already taken a fairly strong stand on the occupied territories. I'll quote it. It's just issued a binding directive on all member states forbidding any funding, cooperation, awarding of scholarships, research funds, prizes to anyone residing in the Jewish settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Also, this requires that any contract signed by a EU country with Israel include a clause stating that the settlements are not part of the state of Israel and are not part of the agreement. That's the strongest statement yet, and I think there's more to come. The U.S. could do something similar, and it could also stop providing the decisive support, and it is decisive, for Israeli programs and actions in the occupied territories. In fact, the US government, here's a startling proposal, might observe its own laws, which are pretty explicit. Here's US law. No military aid may be provided to any unit of the security forces of a foreign country if the Secretary of State has credible evidence that such unit has committed gross violations of human rights, unless it's determined that the country is taking effective measures to bring the responsible members of the security forces, the unit, to justice. Clearly applies to Israel with absolute clarity. So it could be imaginable that the US would follow its own laws, and if it did, that alone would have an enormous impact on Israeli policy formation, which has been the main barrier to some kind of political settlement for 40 years. Well, that's pretty remote from US policies today, but it's worth remembering that these are not graven in stone. The public opinion's changing substantially. Actually, the size of this audience is one of many indications of it. Not many years ago, right here at MIT, the discussions on this topic were broken up by opponents, had to have police protection and so on, same around the country. It's all changed very radically. Now the rights of Palestinians are one of the most lively issues on college campuses, and it's becoming true in much wider circles. Hasn't yet affected the political systems, interesting reasons, but it can happen. It's happened before. It's never been easy. It's always been possible, and quite a lot hangs on the success of such efforts. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky, for such an intriguing talk. I'm sure you all have questions by now, but please keep them for the Q&A session at the end. As for now, we'll move on to our second speaker. Dr. Mads Fredrik Gilbert is a Norwegian physician, humanitarian, activist, and politician for the Revolutionary Socialist Red Party. Dr. Gilbert, the author of both books, Eyes in Gaza and The Night in Gaza, has volunteered as a physician in Gaza during the 2008-2009 war and the war of summer 2014, where he observed the deteriorated health system in Palestine and helped in improving it. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gilbert.
You take my place? Thank you. I just got to put the mechanics to work. Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you to the students. I think it's fantastic to be here. I would never have been here 5 years ago. I would have been chased out. Things are happening. As my mentor and my good friend Noam said, we are maybe reaching a critical mass. So I want to pay big gratitude to the students, the student organizations for organizing this meeting. I think you are very responsible. And standing in front of you, I think I am watching the future. You are going to take over this globe. You're going to take over this country. And there is a huge responsibility on you. I'll throw my jacket, if that's okay. I've dressed up, because I want to show that I've dressed up with a very nice shirt, which I've gotten from some cool kids in Chicago. And if you look closer, it's not Lacoste. It is a little embroidered map of Palestine. And thank you. And The shirt is made by some extremely innovative people. They are not called Urban Outfitters, but they have taken the word, and they are called Turban Outfitters 48. Check it out, Turban Outfitters 48. They make great stuff. So I'm happy to carry this shirt today in order to pay tribute to my friends, the people, my colleagues in Palestine. Can we take off that projector, because I don't want to be in the light. I want to have that off so I can have the full attention on the pictures, if that's possible, please. There are some important moments of truth, and I'll just show you some pictures that I remember very vividly. The first one, you may remember it. It is from the 21st of March, 1960. 50 people were shot dead in the Sharperville massacre. This is Sam Nisma, who take the picture of Hector Peterson, who was 12 and who was killed by a white police officer. More than 500 people were killed in the uprising. It was a turning point when it came to the apartheid in South Africa. A picture can tell you more than 1,000 words. This was the time of an unembedded media that really showed us what the world was. The second picture, you may recall it, from Vietnam, taken on June 8, 1972, where crying Vietnamese children, including Kim Phuc, were running down the route number 1 close to Tram Bang in Vietnam. Vietnamese airplanes had dropped napalm and phosphorus bombs on their village to kill Vietnamese resistance fighters. They were killing civilians. And this picture also was a game changer because it showed us the brutality of the occupation of Vietnam. This picture was taken last year by Ashraf Amra, a brave Palestinian journalist in Gaza. And it shows us the 4 small Palestinian shababs from the Bakr family living close to the Mediterranean Sea on the shoreline in Gaza City, being shot and killed by Israeli occupation forces as they were playing football. Should also be a game changer. But this picture is taken in the era of embedded journalism, where we see much less of the sharp end and the true pictures of what happens when the so-called clinical warfare, the targeted attacks are executed against ordinary people. And I will take this opportunity today to show you some of the examples and the truth on the sharp side, in the sharp end of occupation, and I will use, of course, my experience from Gaza. I work as a medical doctor. I'm an anesthesiologist by training. I'm a professor at the University of Tromsø in the Arctic University of Norway. I have traveled to Palestine on medical solidarity missions since 1981, and I've been working in Gaza since during the last 15 years. When I travel now to Palestine, I travel on behalf of my university hospital and my university as a representative of our governmental university hospital, which considers itself an international solidarity hospital. And this gives me, of course, a huge responsibility, but also a great opportunity to learn, to experience, and to be, to the extent that I can be it, a voice for the voiceless, my colleagues in Gaza, who should actually be the ones standing here tonight, telling the story, but they cannot because they are totally imprisoned in Gaza due to the siege. I will ask you not to take pictures of my patient pictures because of confidentiality issues, but otherwise you may freely take pictures of my graphs and text pictures, and please do not video film for security reasons. So I will take you to Gaza, and I will share with you my impressions of the situation, the consequences, and try to give you a picture of what the impunity means for the people of Gaza. Because it is much more dramatic than just some numbers and some political discussions. It's life and death, it is survival or extinction. These 2 kids, just 2 faces among the many, 3,500 injured Palestinian kids last summer. has been 4, not 3 attacks since 2006. Summer rain, cast lead, pillar of defense, and protective edge. Brutal, systematic attacks. Organized, planned, and executed by the government of Israel. And I just wanted to give you a little sense of what it feels like when the bombing is going on in Gaza, be it in Gaza City with 600,000 inhabitants, or in Rafah in the south with 100,000 inhabitants. Nowhere to escape, no shelters, no early warning systems. You're a naked person with your family in that situation. And it goes on as we are speaking, since the siege and the brutal blockade of Gaza is still just as strict and brutal as it has been since 2007. So if you are 8 years or older in Gaza today, you have been through 4 Israeli military attacks. And I deliberately choose my words. It is an attack and the Palestinians are defending themselves. And they are in their right to defend themselves because international law allows an occupied people to resist the occupation. And you have then had 4 attacks on your life, on your neighborhood, on your family, on your school, on your country. And you've been under siege in a ghetto since 2007. I have been, I would say, fortunate to work in Gaza at Shifa Hospital during all these 4 attacks. I was there in 2006. I was there with Erik Fosse in 2009. I was there in 2012. And I was there last summer in 2014. I'm not going to show many pictures of myself because I'm not the important person here. I just want to tell you that I'm basing my talk to you today, my experiences on all these 4 last attacks. And last year was by far the worst I have ever experienced because of its brutality, its extensive targeting of civilians and the healthcare system. The real heroes are not me or the other European or US volunteers. The real heroes are the people of Gaza and their medical staff. So I dedicate my lecture to these people. Working under extreme conditions. This is from the disaster reception area in Shifa. This is Subi Skaik, my mentor, the medical director of Shifa Hospital. This is Dr. Aburish, the head of surgery. And together with young medical students and young residents and nurses, these are the true heroes. I dedicate my lecture to all my exhausted fellow medical workers, the doctors, the nurses, the paramedics, the volunteers, the medical students who never left their positions, their posts, their calls, their duties, despite the extreme exhaustion, lack of food, lack of water, lack of energy, lack of everything. They carried out their medical work to support their people and to resist the attacks. I dedicated to Shadi, the cleaner of the operating rooms in Shifa, always with a smile, always with a joke. He could clean up the mess in 3 to 4 minutes and make the operating rooms ready for the next operation. 6 operating rooms in Shifa Hospital, always busy. And the hospitals in Gaza lack everything, as you can see on this little inventory of deficiencies for the hospitals, not only Shifa, but all the hospitals in Gaza, as a consequence of a systematic man-made siege that has dried out all the supplies to the medical system, deliberately weakening the healthcare services for 1.8 million people. Politics is nothing else but medicine on a large scale, said Professor Verkov, the guy who first described the Virchow's glandule, pathologist and anatomist and the founding father of public health, actually. And I agree, because health is all about power. It's all about conditions that people live under. Working conditions, living conditions, you know, the way we have our normal lives. And nowhere is that more graphically illustrated than in Gaza. This is a permanent refugee habitat in Gaza. 75% of the 1.8 million people in Gaza are formerly refugees, internal refugees, and they're living in refugee camps like this. Now, the most important factors for public health or disease is not the healthcare system. It's safe water, it's food security, it's human security, it's sanitation, housing, work, education, and then healthcare. You can't achieve public health with helicopters if you don't have the first 7 points in place in a community, in a society, in a nation. And in Gaza, all of these first 7 points are under threat, and certainly the first 3 ones, the most important ones, are lacking. 90% of the water is undrinkable. 80% of the families are totally depending on external food supplies. And human security, as you will see, is totally lacking. You cannot have health in that system, in that situation, in that habitat. Health is the most important foreign policy issue of our time, stated The Lancet, my favorite medical scientific journal. And they have also, as a result of this attitude, started the Lancet Palestine Health Alliance, which I urge you all to check out. It's online. Lots of research, Palestinian research mainly, showing the relation between occupation and health. This is the first printed issue of the series Health in the Occupied Palestinian Territory. Science is liberation, science is resistance, and the Lancet is really a forerunner when it comes to supporting Palestinian research and description of their own situation. Let me just briefly go back, because in Norway we say man's memory is 2 weeks. I don't know how long it is in the United States. I don't have time to take the pictures from 2006, but let's go back to cast lead, that we all remember, 5,400 injured, 1,400 plus killed. These are the numbers: 13 Israeli killed, 1,400 Palestinians. 10 of the 13 were soldiers, 3 were civilians, none were children. And among the killed, 431 were children. Of course, none of them have been the subject of any legal proceedings to find the responsible for killing all these children. 1,800 plus wounded, altogether 2,300 children affected in the cast lead operation. And the investigation into the conduction of the attacks by the Israeli army concluded that the Israeli military forces are protecting the civilians in Palestine. There was so much misery, there was so much losses, there were so many young people who lost their lives, who lost their limbs, who lost their future. Nobody held accountable. 80% civilians. We had just amputated this young man's right foot, and he will be depending, of course, on rehabilitation and processes to have some sort of life afterwards. If we look at the ratio during cast lead, the ratio of killed was 1 Israeli killed to 100 Palestinians killed, wounded 1 to 10. International law states that you have to use proportional force in a conflict. Proportional force has never been used by Israel, and you can see it in the numbers. Pillar of Defense, November 2012. You saw the short videos, 900 injured, more than 100 killed, lasted only a little bit more than a week because the Palestinians were much stronger and could fire back. So the truce, the ceasefire negotiations had a very quick development, and there was a ceasefire. But large number of wounded were taken to the hospitals in all these situations, unsorted, and the hospitals with limited technical and medical supplies and resources had to find improvised ways of solving this immense current of bleeding, injured, and dying patients. The consequences of the attacks, brutal. This is Hanadi Abu Sur, 10 years. She and her brother and 3 more family members were seriously injured when their house was bombed in the middle of the night after a knock on the roof where a drone came and shot a rocket on the roof, telling the family to be out in maximum 45 minutes, because then they took it down with probably a 1-ton bomb. It was early in the morning, and Hanadi and her siblings could not get out of the beds quickly enough. 3 were killed, and she's one of the 5 seriously injured. Protective edge. last year. More than 11,000 injured, 2,250 killed. It mounts every attack. More and more brutal, more and more weapon used. And last year, during the 51 days and nights of attack, they killed 2,251 Palestinians. They injured 11,231. Of them, 10% will have lifelong disabilities. And behind these numbers, there are human beings. Like your sister, your brother, you yourself maybe. Ordinary, good people who have done nothing else, nothing wrong, but being Palestinians born in Gaza. This young Shabab came in after the bombing of Mustashfa Mohammed al-Durra, which is the pediatric hospital in Gaza City. I'll come back to the numbers of bombed and destroyed hospitals. He was looking for his parents. He was not injured enough to be admitted to the hospital. We just checked him out and washed his wounds, then he had a few stitches. But I think the picture can tell you more than 1,000 words what it means to be a young child in Gaza these days. The Israeli army carried out more than 6,000 airstrikes last summer. These numbers are from the UN report, the sort of Goldstone 2 report. I'll leave a copy with you because I think everyone should study this report. It's, of course, totally denied by Israel. The committee members were not allowed entry into Gaza or to Israel, so they had to rely on video interviews. I'm one of the witnesses, by the way, for the report, so all my documentation rests with these open sources. 6,000 airstrikes on Gaza in 51 nights and days, and the destruction was immense. This is from a residential area. It looks like an earthquake, but it's man-made. It's planned, it's executed, it's controlled, and it's fully supported by the US government. A disaster is a disruption of the human ecology that the affected community cannot absorb with its own resources. That's the disaster definition by WHO, and certainly the situation in Gaza was and is a disaster by that definition. But it's a 100% man-made disaster. In cast lead, 2009, they dropped 3,000 artillery shells on Gaza. Last summer, 19,000. That's a 533% increase without having one single international sanction against them. And of course, given this incredible rise, the damage was incredible. The Palestinians shot 4,500 rockets and mortars from Gaza into Israel. 90% of them were shot down by the Iron Dome. I don't support any attack on civilian structures, be it from the United States, from Russia, from China, from Palestine, from Israel. The civilian population should be protected. I don't support Hamas. I don't support Fatah. I don't support Jihad or PA. I support, along with the Norwegian Solidarity Movement, I support the Palestinian people and their right to resist occupation, also with arms. The situation in Palestine is not a difficult conflict. It's always referred to as a difficult conflict. It's not. It's a difficult occupation. And it's the longest lasting occupation in modern history. Now, if anybody in Norway would talk about the German occupation of Norway from 40 to 45 as the Norwegian-German conflict, they would be beaten up. Nobody would call it a conflict. We all call it the German occupation of Norway. And we threw them out by means of the armed resistance. The destruction following the attacks last July, August was immense. This is Gaza City. This is one of the many satellite photos showing from day to day exactly the extent of the destruction from the bombing. 3,500 buildings destroyed only in Gaza City. The world knew every single day, every hour of the day, what the Israelis were doing. And we know the Dahya Doctrine. You heard about the Dahya Doctrine? Established in 2006 when they invaded Lebanon and attacked Beirut to kill the leadership in Hezbollah. The Dahya doctrine is actually to destroy as much as possible. This is formulated here by Major General Gallant. The day after the attack started during Castled, the aim was to send Gaza decades into the past, bomb them back to the Stone Age. So the Dahya doctrine is well documented. We've been writing about it. Others have been writing about it. It's an Israeli military doctrine which aims at destroying as much as possible of the infrastructure to intimidate the inhabitants by inflicting on them large losses of human lives. It is to destroy as much as possible to deter the civilians from supporting the resistance. And it looks horrible. It looks like this. This is from Gaza City, Zaytun, just hours after the ceasefire in 2012. This is actually the house of Hanadia Basur. This is where she was sleeping. This is where her family was sleeping. This is what the Dahya doctrine looks like. Does might means right? No, of course not. That's why we have international law. That's why we have the regulations of proportionality, protection of civilian targets, and so on and so forth. But Israel maintains some sort of immunity from international law, some sort of impunity through all the other regulations that other nations have to obey. And it is, of course, because they have the might given by the support from the US government. One part of that might is, of course, the arsenal of weapons they have. This is a drone. We've all been studying the drone issue. This is an American drone. It carries 4 Hellfire rockets, partially produced in Norway, unfortunately. We give out the Nobel Peace Prize, and we're one of the largest weapon exporters in the world. Shameful, shameful. It has extremely advanced optics here. It can be airborne for 48 hours or more. And the drone pilot is sitting safely in a bunker somewhere in Arizona for your drones, or somewhere in Israel. 4 o'clock, shift is over. You can put on your civilian clothes, take the car, and go home and eat dinner and take your kids to soccer. They are conducting the drones with this joystick, and the little red button will fire the rocket. They see everything on the ground, clearly. The US Air Force is currently educating more drone pilots than jet pilots, actually. And we saw the results. This is a 14-year-old boy who came in to Shifa after a drone attack. His right leg was completely ripped off at the level of the hip. His left leg almost ripped off. He had big concussion marks on the abdomen and the chest, and he dies between our hands. We can do nothing. And it's not by chance. The drone pilot can see the difference between a child and an adult, a man and a woman. They film, every rocket films what is going on down to the target. They know exactly what they're doing. This is another child from 2009. This is Ahmed, 12 years old, who was playing soccer outside his family's house in Al-Montar. He came in. I told the staff we could not resuscitate him. You can see I'm doing CPR here. Both of his legs were completely cut off. Large charcoaling burns. His groin was open. We could see into the abdomen. And his buttocks were totally sliced off the pelvic structures. This is a typical pattern of injury that we saw. We think it's caused by the dime bombs, the dense inert metal explosives. The reason why we started was that somebody whispered to me that he was the nephew of Dr. Issam Abu Ashwa. So, and Abu Ashwa he's a good friend of mine. He's a very good surgeon. He was doing surgery in the room next to this room, tending to another injured. And I said, let's resuscitate until Issam can come in. Issam came in with his screens and his gloves on, his mouth mask. He looked at Ahmed, he nodded and said, yes, it's the son of my sister, the eldest son of my sister. I went around the table, put my arms around my good friend, Issam, and I cried. And I said, I'm so sorry, very helpless words. He looked me in the eyes, lifted my chin and said, Mats, we just have to carry on, this is our life. Went over to Ahmed, stroked his forehead and went back to complete his surgery. All the staff in the Palestinian healthcare system in Gaza have double roles. They are victims, they are relatives, they are bereaved, and they are professionals. And they do their job with the greatest humanity, dedication, and courage. If we look at the number of children killed during the last attack last year, this is a study that was just presented. Out of the 535 children killed, 164 were killed by drone-fired missiles. And of course, that is not by chance. So there is an increasing body of evidence that actually not only civilians, but children were targeted last year. So Ahmed died. He should have been playing soccer, go to school, have a girlfriend, travel around the world. He's dead. Done nothing wrong. And he is the result of the occupation. Shimon Peres said on the 14th of January, 3 days before the ceasefire in 2009, this has been a very successful operation, 90% according to the plan. 428 children killed. Subtract 10%, and you have more than 400 according to the plan. Is anybody held accountable for the killing of Ahmed and the others? No. Well, this is the complete quote from Shimon Peres as they were withdrawing from Gaza. He said that Israel's aim was to provide a strong blow to the people of Gaza so that they would lose their appetite for shooting at Israel. That's all. Of course, a collective strong blow is collective punishment and strictly against international law. And of course, being the president of Israel, he is in the limelight to be called a war criminal, but never taken to court. How many have been indicted? Well, there's actually one Israeli soldier who has been taken to court in Israel. He killed 2 Palestinian women, a mother and her daughter, at point blank. They were coming towards him with a white flag. He shot them both dead. He got 45 days in prison, which is 22 and a half days for killing 1 Palestinian. It's less than you get for drunk driving in Norway. He's the only soldier who has been held accountable for all this killing. So I think that the Israeli impunity is an incredibly important moral, political, and medical challenge in our time. 1 soldier convicted. And the problem of this unending impunity of Israel is, of course, that it will continue. The crimes, the attacks will continue if there is not coming to an end through either the ICC or other international structures, sanctions, whatever, to tell the government of Israel that this cannot go on. This is a quotation from one of the Israeli human rights organizations, B'Tselem, who actually is pointing to the problem that the lack of responsibility and the impunity will certainly make this go on. The Israelis bombed the UN shelters last year. In fact, they bombed systematically UN shelters. They were given the coordinates for the UN shelters 3, 4, 5, 6, up to 7 times. And these are the numbers. They bombed 4 UN shelters, killing, you can see 15, 21, 11 in the shelters. No reactions from the international community, no sanctions. Not a word, just a little whispering from Obama saying, please don't bomb the shelters. Any stop in the provision and the supply of weapons? Nothing. And the key sponsor of what I would call the Israeli state terrorism, because this is truly state terrorism, is the United States. This is a postcard I was given last year, I think it was, with a campaign to hold Israel accountable. I urge you to hold Israel accountable. You are the game changers. It's the US public who are the game changers when it comes to the occupation of Palestine. You have a huge responsibility on your shoulders. I'm so happy to see you here today, because if you are not active, if you don't broaden the activism in the US, this will not come to an end. How much time do I have? 5? Okay. I have 5 minutes. That means in Norwegian. The Norwegians are not so quick. You see, normally we speak with this Nordic accent, and it's a little bit hard to understand. And now you have been clapping a lot, so I have additional time. because we are so slow, so I will have 10 minutes more. He just told me you have 10 minutes more. Okay, the 8-year siege of Gaza. Let's have a look at some of the consequences. Also, extremely undercommunicated, extremely invisualized by the international media. I was in Gaza for 3 weeks last summer before the attack started on commission from the UN OCHA. UN UNRWA, I'm sorry. And I wrote this report on the effect of the siege on the healthcare sector. This was prior to the attacks. And you can find it on the internet. And, insufficient capacity, insufficient supplies, insufficient preventive medicine, no reconstruction, insufficient evacuation of patients, education, and freedom lacking totally. That was before the attack. It's a systematic review of the situation. I could document that food was a critical minimal factor for health. That water was almost non-existing in the taps. They all had to go to wells to find drinking water. And the sewage was running totally unfiltered into the Mediterranean. Critically important factors for population health. So the Israeli siege by itself, not only the bombing, causes widespread negative effects on public health, on the healthcare sector, and on the population. And the special thing, as you know about Gaza, is that the population is extremely young. It's 1.8 million people. I don't call it a prison, I call it a ghetto, because in prison there are prisoners who have done something wrong. The Palestinian people have not done anything wrong. The average age in Gaza is 18 years. 64% are less than 24. This is a child ghetto. And it's been like that for 8 years now. If you look at the consequences from a medical point of view, this collective starvation, because the Israeli occupiers are calculating exactly the amount of calories to let in through the siege, so there is a chronic malnutrition, and actually almost 3/4 of the children less than 2 years are anemic because of malnutrition. And every 3rd child in Gaza is wasted, stunted, or underweight. Stunted means that you're 2 standard deviations shorter than you should have been at that given age. So this is the sensitive indicators of the consequences of this long-lasting starvation of a whole population. So a wounded Palestinian child, like this one, is likely to have, before the attack, before the injury, to have anemia, malnourishment, a negative protein balance, lots of emotional trauma prior to the surgical injuries. And of course, this is heightening the risk for postoperative infections, for septicemia, for delayed wound healing, for more complications. It's a starved population of children being bombed. For the pregnant women, who are about 41,000 at any given time in Gaza, they have 170 deliveries per day and about 30 C-sections. During the attacks, healthcare is not accessible, and for the pregnant women and for the women giving delivery, of course, this is an incredibly dangerous situation. This is reflected now in a very recent study that came out in August this year, showing that for the first time in 50 years, mortality has increased among Palestinian refugee newborns in Gaza. Another very sensitive endpoint indicator of the medical consequences of this collective punishment. So to conclude, the pre-attack situation in Gaza was extremely critical because of the 7-8 years of siege. And then came the bombing starting the 8th of July. This neighborhood in Bet Lahia was totally leveled within 1 hour of Israeli bombardment. This is how it looks. This is how it looks when they are dropping their 1-ton bombs. And of course, we saw the patients coming to Shifa and to the other hospitals. So 533% increase in the tonnage of bombs dropped. Now, normally, we have a balance between medical needs and medical resources, or we may even have more resources than needs, as we have in Norway. In Gaza, it's a disaster situation. On the one hand, the medical needs are greatly increased by the 12,000 injured and all the people coming to the medical system. And the medical resources are greatly decreased, not only because of the effects of the siege and the lack of equipment and drugs in the hospitals, but because the Israelis are attacking the hospitals and the ambulances and the medical staff in addition. So, increased needs and decreased capacity. They bombed almost 50 ambulances and half of the hospitals, and 60% of the primary healthcare clinics were more or less damaged by Israeli bombing. Totally in contravention to international law, of course, because these institutions are to be protected. And this is, again, a 100% man-made situation. So let's look at the attacks on Gaza's healthcare. This was the morning of the 20th of July, the Sheshaya massacre. We heard large screams from the emergency entrance to Shifa. We ran down, and it was Fuad Jaber, our good friend, paramedic, 27 years old, a daughter of 4, and Khaled Hamad, 25, who were both killed when the Israeli forces shot rockets at their ambulance while they were trying to rescue injured in Sheshaya. All on board the ambulance were killed. During the last attack, the last year's attack, they killed 21 medical staff, they injured 83, and they destroyed 47 ambulances. Now, ask yourself one question. What would the world have said if Palestinian fighters, God forbid, had gone into Israel and killed 21 medical Israeli staff, injured 83 Israeli medical staff, and destroyed 47 Israeli ambulances? You know the answer. And the Palestinian people in Gaza know the answer. If you ask them this question, they say, Dr. Matz, don't be so silly. This is a very stupid question. You know the answer. We would be nuked. And this is nothing new. Cast-led, they killed 16 medical staff, mostly paramedics, 38 injured, 15 ambulances destroyed. This goes on and goes on and goes on. Israeli impunity is limitless. They damaged 17 hospitals out of the 37. They damaged 58 primary healthcare clinics, and 1 hospital and 7 clinics were totally destroyed. This is the Al-Wafa Rehabilitation Hospital, a brand new, pretty modern, very modern rehabilitation hospital. And as you understand, rehabilitation is so much needed in Gaza, totally leveled by the Israeli army, totally leveled. Very dramatic situation with evacuation of these multi-handicapped people, some of them on a ventilator, during the night before the Israelis bombed. Any consequences? Nothing. So why is this silenced? Why does this go on unsanctioned? It was quite strange to be in Shifa last summer and see how the US, NATO, the EU were taking the sanction cards, quickly, to impose sanctions on Russia because of what happened in Ukraine, which was far less than what was happening in Gaza. Not a single sanction against Israel. This is the map from UN of all the destroyed hospitals and clinics in Gaza. And this is a recent happening. You heard about the bombing of the Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, in Afghanistan. Totally deplorable. And, there were excuses from Obama. There were excuses and apologies from the head of the US Army. This should never have happened. Big discussion, but nothing about the massive destruction of healthcare in Gaza by the Israeli army, supported by the US. So I'm ending now, Habibi. I'm ending. I'm not ended. I'm ending, which means another 15 minutes normally with Dr. Gilbert. Are you ready for that? Okay. Let's have a few glimpses from Home of the Brave, called by my good friend Max Blumenthal. He calls Shifa Hospital Home of the Brave. Really, it's a fantastic hospital. This is the surgical block. These are some of the surgeons. This is the night of the Sheshaya massacre. You can see it's 4:45 in the morning. We're doing a surgery to try to get shrapnels out of a wounded. We've done several studies published in The Lancet, Dr. Sobiskaik and myself, to study patient flow and triage and all this stuff. You can find that on the internet. The situation was, of course, extremely difficult because of the deficiencies and the large number of injured. This is the operating room. We're just finishing another traumatic amputation of a young man. So nearly 9,000 persons came during the 51 days. 4,500 were injured. Nearly 500 were dying or dead on arrival, and close to 2,000 were admitted. This is from our study, and they are sorted in 3 groups: the hopeless, the lucky, and the needing. These are the lucky ones: the walking, talking wounded, can talk, open airways, can walk, enough blood pressure to the brain, looked at, checked out, cleaned, stitched, sent out again. With their shock, with their losses, with their agony, with their lack of homes, because more often than not, the patients had lost their homes. The needing, those with survivable but large injuries. This is a taxi driver, was shot just outside Shifa. He needs an orthopedic team for his extensive hand injuries. He needs an ENT team for his multiple facial fractures. And he needs a neurosurgical team to take out the fragment, the shrapnel that has entered his brain. They manage. And the unlucky, the hopeless, we try to resuscitate him. Chest tubes in both chests, multiple injuries, multiple shrapnels. He dies between our hands in the emergency. We cannot take him to the operating room. We would have done that in Norway and here because we would have tried everything. You cannot do that in a disaster situation. The killed. This was a family of 4, 2 kids, mother and father. The kids came in first, 8 and 12, I think they were, brother and sister. Sister half of the head away, and the little brother with a nicely knitted sweater with an opening, a round opening. The problem was just that there was no head. It was beheaded. The parents came just after. In my hospital, the stretchers in the emergency has 9 nice cotton white linens on, crisp, clean linens. In Gaza, the cover is plastic, and when you look closer, you can see the zipper. You can open the linen or the cover to make it a body bag. So you can just roll them directly into the body bag because it's so frequent that they are dying or dead. When we don't have these plastic body bags, they're just wrapped up in a linen and taken to the morgue, which was completely filled all the time. The children, 551 killed. You can do the same maneuver. Imagine that the Palestinians had killed 551 Israeli children. Often injuries that needed surgery, minor surgery. This kid with an amputated toe would have been taken to, general anesthesia in the OR. No time for that. So he gets a little local anesthetic, not enough. So 2 strong men are holding him, 3 actually, while the surgeon is cutting away the remaining bone. Extremely painful. Burns, he came in the Seshaya night, and the picture doesn't tell the full story. I took this picture as I was about to intubate him because he had facial injuries, he had large burns, his hair is totally charcoaled, he has splinters, he has shrapnels probably, and we need quickly to intubate him to make sure that it's not choking. I put my camera down. I didn't know I had hit the video button, and when I came home to Tromsø after I had left Gaza, I was looking through my material and this video came up. And I could not remember, my friends, the sounds that he was making. And that tells you quite a bit about the perceptual focus that you have in these situations, because many people ask us, how can you manage all this? Well, ask the Palestinians. It is to concentrate. Now, these sounds are heard by the children. These sounds are heard by the parents. These sounds are heard and never forgotten by the Palestinian healthcare workers. And I'll play you from Gaza the sound of this child just about getting into anesthesia. I'm standing here with my greens. It's good. I give him some ketamine IM. Oxygen mask. This is good. This is good. Habibi. 3,500 injured children. Not all of them were screaming like this, but many of them were screaming like this. It will never be forgotten by the Palestinians, nor by us who were there. But it seems like Israel is still enjoying total immunity from the consequences. He survived. His brother survived. He's in Gaza. His future is part of our responsibility. He's still in this ghetto. He's still under siege. He cannot travel. If he needs more medical attention, it's more likely than not that he will not be allowed out by the Israeli occupation forces. 10 years old, shrapnel to the neck, to the carotid. In addition, open fracture threatening the nerve and the blood vessels in the leg. Very complicated surgery, but well done by the Palestinians. So I will jump to the end now, because I will respect partially the time limits. And I want to end by telling you one single story about the long-term effects of what the children are experiencing in Gaza. Now, this started, of course, to save. But what I will end with is to tell you the story about Samar Abdrabu. She lived in Abdrabu, which is a small village north of Gaza City. Her father, a farmer, poor people, living together with his wife and Samar's 2 siblings and the grandmother. And one day during the attack in 2009, an Israeli tank came to their neighborhood. The tank commander ordered the family to get out by a loudspeaker. They were walking out of the house, and as they went out, the father was waving a white flag. An Israeli soldier came out of the tank, took his M16 rifle, and started shooting at the family, shooting all the 3 kids one by one. Samar came in to Shifa in the afternoon. We didn't know what had happened. She was very quiet, beautiful little girl, looking after her, looking around to see where her parents were. I asked, they said, we don't know. She just came in. We turned her to the side. She had a large wound in the back. I was sure it was a shrapnel. I couldn't imagine that anybody would shoot at a child. We put in chest tubes, took her to the OR quickly. The reason why she was not crying was, of course, that she was paralyzed from the nipples and down. Her spine was totally transected. We could do nothing. It turned out that the 2 siblings were left dying by the Israeli soldiers who denied the ambulance access to Abdrabu. A neighbor came with a donkey cart and a donkey. They shot the donkey and the donkey cart driver. Finally, Samar was evacuated to Shifa. She was evacuated further to El Arish and to Belgium. I went to see her last year in October. Samar is living with her family in Brussels. She is still paralyzed from the waist and down. Khaled, who tried to save his family, is a janitor in Brussels, so he is now for the 3rd time a refugee. Samar will never be able to walk again, of course, but she's keeping a high spirit. The resilience of the Palestinian people, the resilience of the Palestinian children is just incredible. And she tells me, thank you. She tells me she's the best in the class. She tells me she will go on. Khaled says she's doing the best out of the situation. They have made 1, 2, 3 new kids after the attack. But nobody has been held accountable for Samar's shooting and for the killing of her 2 siblings. And this is a huge moral problem. And history will judge us. There are times in history before when the Western world turned their back to the execution of people. And it should not happen again. So let's not forget all these children that have been orphanated, or they have lost their parents, who have lost their siblings, and of course all the children that are having extensive medical needs not being covered. The Lancet wrote an editorial in 2009 where they said that the leaders, through their inaction, are complicit of a preventable tragedy. Everything that you have seen, everything you've heard now was 100% avoidable had there been political solutions and not military solutions. The root cause of all of this is the occupation of Palestine. It is the unjust attacks on Gaza, And I end by a quote from my respected colleague, Dr. Professor Rita Gyakman. She says in a Lancet paper that hope for improving health and quality of life for Palestinians will exist only once people recognize that the structural and political conditions that they endure in the occupied Palestinian territory are the key determinants of population health. It's the occupation, stupid. So I have a prescription as a doctor, after having worked for so many years with the Palestinians and been 15 years in Gaza and been there for the last 4 attacks. It's not to send more field hospitals or drugs or syringes or surgical teams. It is number 1, lift the siege. It's number 2, stop the bombing of Gaza. It's number 3, end the occupation. And it's number 4, end the Israeli apartheid politics. That's my prescription. And one day, inshallah, maybe Samar, maybe some other of the Palestinian kids, maybe Jumana, will disarm the Israeli occupation soldiers, like on this graffiti from Banksy on the wall on the West Bank, and send them back to Israel to be taxi drivers and fishermen and teachers and whatnot, and not occupation soldiers. And until that day, I will maintain my solidarity work. I hope you will do your solidarity work, because it's all our responsibility. Gaza, to me, is resilience. It's survival, it's dignity, resistance, and deep humanity. Gaza teaches us life. Shukran jazilan. Thank you very much. Thank you. Come, we're going to sit here. I'm sorry, I went a little bit over time.
Thank you, Dr. Gilbert. That was a really thought-provoking presentation. Certainly, if the time allowed, we would spend the rest of the afternoon learning more about your experience and insights. Now it's time for the panel discussion, Q&A format. I'll pass the microphone here to my colleague to moderate the Q&A.
All right, so we'll be opening the floor for questions. If you do have a question, we have mics on both sides of the room. Please come on up and ask your question, then go back to your seat. I ask that your questions are straightforward and no follow-ups will be allowed. I'll be alternating between both sides of the room. Let's start up there to the left.
This one is working. Yalla habibi. مش مشكلة.
So actually, can I have like 2 questions, or is it?
Just one.
Okay, just one. So you mentioned the Saudi-Israeli connection, and I was wondering, do you have any substantial proof that there is any sort of Saudi-Israeli alliance, or that there is actually communication between them on a governmental level? And it just seems to me that as far as both governments are concerned, there isn't any actual connection between them.
Is there any Saudi-Israeli connection?
We don't know. Saudi Arabia is a completely... Did you hear me without this? Can you hear me without this? Yeah, I don't think I need it. Saudi Arabia is a totally secretive society. There are no documents, there are no records, there's no archives. There's essentially nothing. So we don't know in any detail. Israel, of course, wouldn't publish an official alliance. So we can only surmise from the record, which pretty much goes back to 1967. Remember that the Israeli invasion, the Israeli attack in 1967, 1967 war was a tremendous gift to Saudi Arabia. There was a conflict going on in the region between extremist radical Islam, Saudi Arabia, and secular nationalism, that was Egypt. And it was a live conflict. It was mostly in the Yemen at the time, major, serious war. And Israel basically destroyed the basis for secular Arab nationalism. And it was a tremendous gift to the radical Islamic forces led by Saudi Arabia. And it's continued pretty much since. In 1970, that's when U.S.-Israeli relations really were established in their contemporary form. We know this very well from the U.S. side, plenty of documentation. In 1970, you may recall in Black September, the Palestinians were being pretty brutally attacked by the Jordanian forces. And there was concern in the United States that Syria might intervene to protect the Palestinians from destruction. The United States was completely mired in Southeast Asia at the time. It was right at the time of the invasion of Cambodia. This country was practically blowing up. There was no way for the U.S. to intervene. So they asked Israel to mobilize forces to compel Syria to back off. And that was regarded here as a considerable protection, not only to the Hashemite monarchy, but also the Gulf monarchies. And in fact, U.S. aid to Israel quadrupled that year. And it pretty much continues like that. We can't find a specific document that says, here's a treaty. Because Saudi Arabia, we have no documents. But the facts pretty much fall together.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky. Let's take a question from up the right of the room.
Thank you both so much for being here. You guys are real heroes to all of us, I'm pretty sure. My question is more about college campuses. I was in Palestine for 2.5 months earlier this year, and now I'm in my first year at Wellesley College with a bunch of us here supporting the cause. But since the beginning of the school year, I've experienced considerable setbacks for expressing my point of view about Palestine, including being removed from a sports team and being accused of anti-Semitism and condoning terrorism by an adult staff member of the school. And I'm wondering, what are your thoughts about stopping the pretty widespread trend on college campuses of censorship and suppressing productive dialogue? Thank you so much.
Did you get? No, I'm sorry.
She's been prosecuted for being pro-Palestinian. She's been taken off the sports team. She's been arrested. She's been accused of anti-Semitism, and she asks, is there any way to stop the ongoing harassing of pro-Palestinian activities? She's been to Palestine for quite some time.
Well, there are theoretically legal measures, but the real answer, I think, is in your hands. If there is a strong popular movement that supports the kinds of activities you're describing, the efforts at retaliation, repression will back off. That's the way things work. There are laws, but there has to be sufficient mobilization and activism to insist that they be implemented, and that actions of the kind that you're describing will be regarded as so intolerable that they'll lead to demonstrations, protests, and authorities will have to back off. There's no other way.
Can I have a comment?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think you're extremely brave. I salute your bravery. I really do. And I think the spontaneous applause you're getting is telling you where the people are standing. And I think there is only one way to combat this. It is to stick to the truth. You're dangerous because you've been to occupied Palestine. You know what you're talking about. I've been now denied entry to Gaza by the Israeli government. Why? Because I'm so dangerous with a stethoscope and a camera and a pen? No, because what is the most dangerous thing for the Zionist Colonialist is the truth on the ground. That's why you're dangerous. Don't give up. Be strong, and we will support you, okay? Yes.
Next question, please.
Okay, so this is mainly for Dr. Gilbert. And first of all, I just want to say thank you so much for doing all your work to help care for people and for bringing the suffering to light. I want to do everything I can to change the situation. And one thing I was wondering, you were talking about cutting U.S. military aid to Israel. And so my experiences from talking to Israelis is that most Israelis are convinced that everything that Israel is doing is to protect their lives and for their security. And so like one thing I'm wondering, for example, is if Israelis really believe that what they're doing is to protect their own lives, will they even change at all if, say, U.S. military aid is cut? And also Professor Chomsky is welcome to answer it.
I don't have an answer to that. I think it's part of the political rhetorics. I don't think the Zionist rulers believe a minute that they do it to protect their security. Look at the numbers, it's ridiculous. This is an expansionist political program. They want to make life conditions as miserable as possible in Gaza, to make a split, probably a division, maybe a civil war, to discourage the Palestinians from resisting. And I can tell you that the last time I was in Gaza last summer, I've never before experienced such a broad base of support for the resistance. The doctors, the nurses, the paramedics, they all said, this is not about Hamas or Fatah, this is not about Ramallah or Gaza, this is about us, the Palestinian people resisting occupations, and we will never surrender. And that is their message to the world. What they argue about security, it is in a way to me irrelevant. Because if you look at the realities, this is expansion, it's occupation, it's terror bombing, and I'm against it. I'm against apartheid. I'm against colonialism. So I don't care about these rhetorics. And I think that most people, if they get to know the realities and look into it and travel to occupied Palestine, they will see that this is empty rhetorics. For the people of Israel, well, they are pretty much in a bubble, as far as I can see. There is growing right-wing movements. Read Max Blumenthal's book, Goliath. And it is a dangerous situation for the Israeli people. I don't know how they will solve it, but I know that the only way out is increased international support for the Palestinian struggle against occupation.
Thank you, Dr. Gilbert. Let's go ahead with the next question, please.
Professor Chomsky, I wanted to ask, is there any actions that the Palestinians can take unilaterally to achieve their freedom, or do they rely on U.S. public opinion and U.S. politics? Is military resistance an answer, or is there nothing the Palestinians can do by themselves?
In Palestine.
In Palestine.
Oppressed people cannot, under circumstances like this, forceful resistance is a gift to the oppressor. That's their comparative advantage. Their comparative advantage is violence. So if you move to the arena of violence, they win. That's pretty much the way it always works. The Palestinians can and have, in fact, been engaged in nonviolent resistance. They're brutally attacked and beaten. But nonviolent resistance can be effective on one condition. It has outside support. If people carry out nonviolent resistance against a brutal, violent oppressor, they'll be smashed. If they have outside support, they can gain their objectives. So the answer's in our hands.
Next question.
This one is working.
Wish I could turn that light off.
Thanks. Okay. Thanks for both presentations. They were really brilliant, and for all the work that you do in these classes, like really inspiring. So my question for Dr. Gilbert is, so under international humanitarian law, like the biggest excuse that Israel uses about the attacks on hospitals is that it's like under a military advantage because Hamas is using them to like hide and operate from there. And like launched rockets close to hospitals and schools. Did you see any evidence of that? Did you ever have any encounters with Hamas groups operating from hospitals? And what's the interaction with the medical?
Yeah, good question. Thank you. If I had seen that Shifa Hospital had been used in any way against the Geneva Convention, I would have left on the hour. I've been there for 15 years. I've been in and out, and the Palestinians are not stupid. They are the most surveilled people in the world. The Israelis have 25,000 paid informants, collaborators among the Palestinians. You must always account that there is one collaborator if you're together with 5, because it's so prevalent. So the Israelis know everything that's happening. They have not come up with any evidence, any proof of the Palestinian resistance abusing medical institutions. On the contrary, every time there was an attack in 2009 and last year, the international commissions ran to the hospital, like to Al-Quds Hospital near Qusar. They came to Shifa every day. And there is not a single shred of evidence. There was a Finnish journalist who said that a rocket was shot from Shifa. She denied that immediately when she saw how it was used. It was fired from outside Shifa, close to it, yes, but not from Shifa. And secondly, I think it's important to understand also international law, which was discussed after the attack on the MSF hospital in Afghanistan. Because there it was said that resistance fighters had been around the hospital and even in the hospital. And if you are attacking a mixed military and civilian target, the civilian protections take priority over the military attack. So even if you had somebody around the hospital, you're not allowed, according to international law, to bomb a hospital. But the answer is clear. I have not seen it. It's not been documented. And I never think that the Palestinian would be as stupid as to use schools or hospitals for their struggle. Okay?
There's one little point that could be added to that. Over the last 70 years, there has been one time when the Jewish population of Palestine was under a real threat. That was in 1948. And what they did at the time was use civilian structures as the base for military actions. In Jerusalem, the Haganah, the military forces, would not permit people to leave because they wanted civilians to be inside to be targets of attack. They emplaced military facilities on the roofs of houses and so on, so they would be a little more secure from attack, and if there was attack, civilians would be killed. Now, this is all discussed in the Israeli military literature. Yeah, that's what happens.
Just a little additional comment. It's been a rhetoric all the time that Hamas and the Palestinians are hiding between or among the civilians. Well, if the Israeli army wants to fight man to man, why don't they just lift the siege and let the civilian population flee and then take the struggle? It's impossible to be more than 100 meters away from civilians in Gaza because it's so small and it's so totally overpopulated. And all the Israeli commanders, the Minister of Defense, the generals, are living in civilian parts of Tel Aviv and in Israel. So does that give the Palestinians right to bomb civilian targets in Israel? Not, of course not.
All right, so due to time constraints, we will only be taking one last question. So please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you for being here and inform us with all the information that you presented. My question is about the so-called two-state solution. And in my opinion, and realistically speaking, it's a failed solution. And we were forced to accept the occupying forces in Palestine and accept Israel. Now they're asking us to accept Israel as a Jewish state, meaning there is no place else for anyone else. So, and a two-state solution, at least the way it's presented now, it's not a solution. So I'm surprised, why wouldn't the Palestinian negotiators push and play the same game that the Israelis are playing? They claim they are the only democracy in the Near East. So why don't we have a one state with equal right, secular state, and everybody has equal rights, and let history play its role.
Well, let me ask you another question. Why not have peace on earth and eliminate all weapons?
Well, I agree with you if we could.
There's a crucial distinction which every activist should understand between proposals and advocacy. We can propose, let's all love each other, let's have peace, everything will be wonderful. It reaches the level of advocacy when you tell us how we're going to get there, okay? Now, let's talk about one state. Personally, I've been in favor of it all my life. 70 years I've been writing about it and speaking about it. It's usually called a binational state, which is much more realistic. It's a fine idea, but how do you get there? Well, at different times, there have been different possibilities. Since 1975, when Palestinian nationalism kind of reached the international agenda, there is exactly one way to get there. There is one proposal on the table as how to get there in stages, with the first stage being the two-state settlement that is endorsed by the entire world, aside from Israel and the US. There's a good possibility. It's not a good solution. I don't like it. I think it's crazy. But if it's established, there's at least a possibility, and I think a likelihood, that if the cycle of violence declines, as it will, the artificial borders will begin to erode. In fact, that's happened in the past. Whenever there has been a decline in the cycle of violence, what you find is the beginnings of commercial interchanges, cultural interchanges, and others. And it's possible that by mutual consent under those conditions, there will be an erosion of borders which will move towards some kind of integration. That kind of integration might, and I think optimally should, lead to some either maybe a federation, some kind of binational system. And in my opinion, that should not be the end. The borders of Israel and the surrounding countries were imposed by the imperial powers. If you actually, just tell you a personal experience. I happened to be living in Israel in 1953 in a kibbutz, and I was hiking up in the north, and I was a student, backpack student, hiking up in the north, and on a road behind me, a Jeep came by, and the guy started yelling at me, telling me to come back. He said, "You're in the wrong country." I crossed into the Lebanese border, into Lebanon. There's no natural border between Israel and Lebanon in the Galilee. It's imposed by imperial force, and those borders shouldn't be inviolable. I think ultimately one would hope that there would be a move towards broader integration, which would eliminate, at least erode, the imperial imposed borders. That's happened elsewhere in the world. But going back to the so-called one state, binational state, if you can think of another approach, I'd like to hear it. The only approach that has been proposed that has any meaning whatsoever is the one that's in stages. Now, if the two states settlement is abandoned, what's the alternative? It's not one state. The alternative is that Israel will continue to do exactly what it's doing, and we know what that is. It's not a secret. Take over Greater Jerusalem, this huge area, take over the so-called seam behind the separation wall, corridors to the east going through Malda Adumim in the south, through Ariel Adumim in the north, take over the Jordan Valley, where Palestinians are being kicked out and settlements are being built, take over, of course, Area C, most of the West Bank. That's the alternative, and Palestinians will be confined to unviable enclaves with a center in Ramallah for the elite where they can live nicely. That's the standard neo-colonial system. And Gaza will be destroyed. That's the alternative to a two-state settlement. The one state is a possibility, but as far as I can see, only approaching it in stages. And again, if there's another proposal, I'd like to see it. A lot of people talk about one state, but they don't give a method for getting from here to there, and that's what's critical.
And about the borders, we are all aware of the Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1960.
Pardon?
No follow-ups, please.
I have a feeling we're going towards the end. Is that right? Yes?
That is correct.
I just want to thank my, I can't even call it a co-chair, my big brother, Noam Chomsky, for being such a wise man and keeping up the spirit for so long. Imagine that all of you, all of us, are as vital and strong when we're getting so mature. And I think it's all a question of being present in this world, to read, to be a serious participant in what is happening, to travel, and to make your own critical opinion, to be a critical thinker. Not to fall into the trap of laziness, of intellectual laziness, and believing in mainstream media. They're all lying. That's the lie industry. So, please, if you want an alternative, this is my last book, Night in Gaza. If you buy it, it's the account of what happened last year. All the income goes to the medical solidarity work in Norway. So it's another source of critical information. And keep up the good activism, keep up the critical work, be active, support Palestine. Shukran jazeelan.
Thank you everyone for attending. This is the end of the event. Thank you all for the peaceful cooperation. I hope you enjoy your day.